Okay, I
Oh,
think
there we
it's working.
go. Now I see
Yay.
it.
Okay. It looks like it's still loading, but let me double check.
Oh, no, no skin off
If
my
it
back.
came if it came up, it's probably good, but
Yeah. Yeah, and I see I've got a little indication up top, both the
okay,
pop-up and there's a little
perfect.
broadcasting symbol at the top.
Perfect.
We're rocking and rolling.
Awesome. So I think it is working. Sorry about that delay. But welcome to episode 13 of Living in the Texas Hill Country with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I'm Carly, I'm the agent in Blanco County, and I have Chase Brook with me here today. Luckily, we're getting some rain, and so Liz is dealing with some flooding issues. Not personally, just kind of precautionary. But so Liz is out today. But yeah, Chase, thanks for joining us today. If you want to introduce yourself, I'd love you to. Chase and I have done a few programs together, and I love his talk, so I'm super glad he's joining us today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the invite, Carly, and this is the commute time is right, let me tell you. But yeah, so I'm Chase Brook. I'm the extension program specialist for small acreage wildlife. I'm based out of Stephenville. So similar job as what Liz does, but I get to cover everything northish of Austin. Um, and so a lot of my programming and what I do and I teach is kind of small acreage land management and conservation, as well as, with a particular emphasis on new and beginning landowners. I kind of come from a range management background and, in my copious amounts of free time, I'm currently wrapping up a PhD at A&M with a research focus on brush pile burning and kind of helping come up with better ways to manage the brush we have because everyone's got lots of it. And especially in the Texas Hill Country, it seems like you can't hardly sneeze on your ranch without accidentally making another brush pile.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, I think it's pretty timely. Like I said, also with the rain that we're getting, I was a little nervous at first because when we were planning this episode out, we hadn't gotten rain for a couple of weeks, and it was a good topic while we were getting rain, and then we didn't, so I kind of hesitated, but I'm glad we're doing it now. So thank you again. But I guess to start out, what's like the first thing that people should think about when it comes to brush pile burning, or how do you even make a brush pile?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing when it comes to brush pile burning is ideally, we don't always have this option, but ideally it starts with kind of how we're building these piles and where they are, right? The best brush piles are the ones that we can burn quickly, burn cleanly and completely, and they are not located next to, underneath canopies of trees or right next to your gasoline storage, tanks or anything like that. But I think the rule of thumb I've always had is just, smaller piles or piles built with smaller diameter fuels will burn faster and they will burn more thoroughly and safely than larger piles or ones built with logs, right? And so when I say small fuels, what I'm talking about is, we're aiming for branches, not trunks, right? So think limbs less than, 12, 18 inches in diameter. Um, right now I've got some research going on that we can talk about later, but for instance, we found relatively small piles, so maybe 6 feet tall by about 15-foot diameter. With those smaller fuels, they burn down to embers in probably 30 minutes, and then they are completely out within 4 hours, right? And so and the reason I mentioned that, and we're not always blessed with the ability to build the piles. Oftentimes we inherit these big monstrous windrows, and things like that. But I always like to say, in the land of sunshine and rainbows, that's our ideal pile because, it means that when we light that pile and we burn it, we know it'll be done in a reasonable time frame, right? And we can keep eyes on it, and we can we're not having to babysit a pile of coals or smoldering logs for days or weeks at a time. right? Because a lot of times that, once we get past the actual burning component, most of the danger that and risk in brush pile burning is actually from that, the smoldering fuels that, continue to, I mean, they'll smolder for days or weeks. And usually that's and that smoldering, the wildfires that cause it, usually it's because we'll have winds pick up and it'll kind of rekindle that fire and then carry some embers out into the unburned grass right next to it. Let's see. I think the other thing, excuse me, in the while we're working in the land of sunshine and rainbows, if I had my druthers, we would not have soil in those piles. And you mainly see this when like when we're bulldozing juniper or cedar trees and we're bulldozing mesquite. You'll get these big root balls that kind of pull up with the tree. Those are very problematic from a burning standpoint. Mainly, so I mean, you think of it, you have all this wood, in the roots that's inside the soil, which is a really good insulator. So you get these embers that creep in, but they're isolated from the oxygen. So they just smolder. And at some point, call it wind, or maybe you hit it with your pickup truck, or, a cow rubs against it extra hard and it breaks that clod open. Suddenly you have these nice embers that again, they'll flare back up, and that's a potential ignition source. If you do have clods in a brush pile, one of the research projects I would love to tackle in the future is like, how do we handle these clods in a pile? Best thing to do is just after everything kind of smolders down, get a rock breaker or a shovel or your tractor and just go in and break those clods apart, right? Until you do, it doesn't matter how much water you put on it, if it's protected right in the middle of those clods. So I think as far as, like kind of how to build them and kind of the ideals, I think that's where I would start, right? Let's see. I would also say, never build a pile that you are not able to suppress, right? If you're going to be burning, make sure you've got, fire line, it disked around it, at least twice as that fire line should be at least 2 to 3 times as wide as that pile is tall, right? So most fuels, and when we think about brush piles too, and if you burn brush piles, you've probably seen this, you're going to get the flames, like the peak flame height on that pile is going to be about 3 times as long as that pile is tall, right? And then what happens is, especially when we have high winds, those flames, like if this is the flame right here, when we have a high wind, it's going to push those flames over, and it only takes maybe 8-10 mile-an-hour winds until you're getting those flames laying over very close to their side, or you're getting a lot of heat being moved laterally, right? So that's why it's really important having those good fire lines, at least, at least 2 to 3 times as wide as the pile is tall. And then having water on site, again, kind of a no-brainer, but, yes, for cleaning up any, if it's doing, trying to creep out, anything like that, it's important, but also so that before you leave the property and before you leave that pile, before you take eyes off it, you are able to put water on it and extinguish any coals and embers. We don't want to leave anything burning unattended. It is, it is almost shocking the number of stories of, from landowners, just if you've been burning brush piles, you've had one get away from you a little bit. And most of the time it's because we either maybe you didn't have the right weather conditions or something like that, but just as often it's, hey, it's lunchtime, and we go back up to the house and it's, we thought it was still kind of smoldering, and then you turn around and you see smoke coming up and it got out. So again, kind of my emphasis, we want a pile that burns fast, that burns clean, and it burns it to ash as soon as possible so that we can have that area safe and secure on the property.
Yeah.
That was a really long answer for your question.
No, all good. Because it kind of helped me come up with some other things too. So we talked a little bit about, the size of the fuel that we have in there and how that relates to how long it's going to burn. I'm sure there's not an average size brush pile, but if you had to give an example of a situation, whether the whole pile be a size or however you figure that. But what, like, how do you know how long the pile burns? If you're a landowner and you just got some stuff stacked up and you have no idea what to expect, is this going to be hours, days? How do you kind of figure that out?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And so, kind of off the cuff, I would say if you're burning brush piles, you should plan on at least dedicating 3 or 4 hours to it. And that's not just the lighting part, but that is so it goes all the way down to that ember stage. Um, and so, when we think about a brush pile too, it's also worth differentiating, the different stages of burning, right? So you have it at the very beginning where it's not on fire. We're going to initially light it, and then it's going to go in that initial ignition at the fire is going to move through the pile and kind of hit that peak heating time, that peak combustion, and then it's going to start winding down into what we call and that would be what we call the active flame stage, right? Which, was, I don't think it was termed by Aggies, but it makes a lot of sense. If you can see flames, there are it is in the active flame stage. And when you don't see flames, and you just see glowing coals and embers, that's going to be that smoldering ember phase until all of those are out, right? And so, the active flame stage, in my experience, is generally, about, depending, across many pile sizes, that could be as short as 20 minutes. That could, on smaller piles with small fuels, for larger piles with large fuels, that might go up to 45 to an hour. Again, just kind of depending. When you have windrows too, and you have to, the fire propagation through that windrow, that can kind of extend that time. But when we think so, but when we think about how long would it take to burn a given brush pile, I would say from a time budgeting standpoint, it's assuming you have all your prep done, it'd be about 30, probably just give yourself about 30 minutes, 45 minutes for a small pile, hour and a half for a very large one. And then I would say you're going to want at least 3 or 4 hours of that smoldering phase. Now that smoldering phase, things that are going to increase that time, like I said earlier, that's going to be dirt clods present. That's going to be very large fuels, and especially, what's notorious for this is when you're going and you're clearing a bunch of dead live oaks or something like that. And you've got these big old oak trunks in that pile. That's going to be one of your big risks for smoldering, or maybe you have some cottonwoods or something that are hollow on the inside, and it just, they're just going to smolder for a very, very long time. Ways to shorten that, like assuming, we have the pile we're given and we have these large fuels or the dirt clods, and, that's just what we're living with. Biggest things I can recommend is, especially once it's in that smoldering phase and it's not, you're not going to roast yourself to death just getting close to it with a shovel, is really stirring up that ash, right? We don't want that ash, kind of like the soil and the dirt clods, that can insulate those embers and can let them smolder longer. So we want to expose as much of those embers, safely to the air as we can. Don't obviously go throwing it in the air or anything like that. We just want to stir them up, right? Think of like a campfire. We just want to stir the campfire up a little bit. Break up those dirt clods if they're present. Again, a rock breaker or a shovel. If it's a very large pile, you're probably gonna have to work the edges first, and then as it kind of burns down, then you can start working your way towards the middle. Just again, very much dependent on personal comfort and protection and safety. Let's see. I would also say when you can, oftentimes you'll have unburned, maybe some like ends and tips of branches and stuff like that on the edge. Chuck them to the middle, right? We don't want to leave any potentially unburned fuel around. The middle is the safest place in that regard. And so we want to be pushing unburned or, larger smoldering fuel to the middle, breaking up any soil, and then kind of pulling that ash off the top so that we can expose more of it. one important distinction as well is, I would always say burn in the morning, when we can. Our mornings, if you live in Texas, your mornings are going to be humid. That is going to be the most humid part of the day. And typically speaking, after lunch is when that relative humidity starts to really drop and our wind speeds pick up, right? And so when we're burning brush piles, what we want is high air humidity and lower wind speeds, right? This is completely opposite from what you'd want from like a pasture, broadcast, prescribed burn. But the whole idea is we're trying to get this pile burned when all the grass around it is the least likely to catch on fire. And most piles, once you get them ignited, I mean, once they're rolling, they are going to be going. When you have that pile, you're probably not going to be able to put it out until it is coals. And then that also gives us plenty of time throughout the day to make sure it's completely out. One thing people don't always recognize is in Texas, it is illegal to be burning during the night. Between sunset to sunrise, it is illegal to have flames, to have smoke. It should be out cold by
No
sunset.
smoldering either.
No. And there's it's an air quality thing, and that's kind of where a lot of that regulation comes from. But, again, ideally, in the land of sunshine and rainbows, we would start, and weather permitting, we would start in the morning. We would hit that, at sunrise, maybe an hour after, we'd hit that, get that pile lit. We would hit that peak flame stage and have it down to embers by, mid to late morning. And then by early afternoon, all we're doing is just monitoring ashes and making sure that we're, stirring those fuels up, getting them to burn down so that by the time the evening comes around, all we got it, if anything smoke, still has some smoke coming off, that's the $100 20-gallon spray rig on a four-wheeler, and you go put the wet stuff on the red stuff until it stops smoking. That to me would be like the ideal situation. And that would be even with a larger pile. I think I would also encourage folks, don't burn them alone. If you can, have at least 3 or 4 people with you. And the reason being that, again, unlike with the broadcast burn, and while that pile is burning, it is physically obstructing your ability to see beyond it, right? So when you have 2 or 3 people, you're able to have a much better view of what's going on around that pile and to spot, any fire that's kind of creeping towards the fire lines, or God forbid, you're getting a little spot fire or something like that. You can get on it, you can hammer it out, put it out, when it's small and it's easy. Also, if you're going to be spending, 2 to 4 hours doing this whole brush pile burning thing, having company is really nice.
Yeah.
And gives you someone to talk with and, all that kind of stuff too. So I think that answered your question.
Yeah. And it answered my next one too, which was what are the right conditions? So thank you. And then you were kind of talking a little bit too about, the stuff that's on the outside, maybe it hasn't burned yet, kind of mix it up, put it in the middle. Is there a possibility that a pile would be too big to do that? How big is too big for a bird pile?
Good question. My honest, not very scientific answer is that a brush pile is too big when it is too big for you to feel comfortable burning it.
Sure.
I mean, I know that's not like a very quantitative answer, but realistically, everyone's got, their comfort levels are going to be different. Someone who's safely burned hundreds of piles and, Sonora is going to have a different opinion on it than, someone who's a new landowner in the Piney Woods. I mean, that's a very much a personal comfort, skill, and practice question. I think generally speaking, there does become a size where you just have to bring in more logistics, right? So when you have large windrows with lots of soil in them and tons of large diameter fuels, I know I'm like hitting that horse to death, but it's just, some of
It's needed.
those, that's where it's like you would really want to get, you're going to have at least 4 or 5, 10 people and equipment and things like that to really be able to safely burn it.
Sure.
And I think the other times, where too big might be an issue is, a pile, you know, a pile, it goes back to the location of it, right? Um, and so again, is it right by your hay barn? Is it right next to a fence or something like that? That's going to obstruct your ability to manage that pile burn. The other thing too, and this is not, you know, in way it's related. The bigger the pile, the bigger the impact you're going to see after you burn it, right? So, if I would always encourage you folks, don't build your brush piles in the middle of your best Bermuda grass or grazing pasture. Um, Brush piles are great for that cruddy, raggedy little dirt patch that grows nothing but Johnson grass, and you can't make anything good stick on there.
Sure.
And the reason is, even in a small brush pile, you're going to see those scars, impacting your forage production and productivity for at least a year to 1 to 5 years, maybe longer, and kind of what happens is the bigger the pile and the bigger the fuels, the more heat gets moved into the soil. And as that heat goes into the soil, that it's basically cooking all the roots, all the resprouting zones for the grasses and the plants underneath. It's also going to be neutralizing or burning up any seeds in there, right? And so, it's one of the reasons why when you have a burn scar after a brush pile, you always see the most weird, invasive, unnatural stuff pop up in it. It's because all the normal, native plants in our seed bank, they got cooked out, right? So anything that's coming in, that's what's being brought by birds, by
Mm,
animals, by the wind. And it's usually those, early successional, I mean, for lack of a better term, weeds, right? So
sure.
your annual grasses, your annual forbs, things that put out a whole lot of seed and grow really quickly, and they have no competition. Um,
So
so
it's different than like a prescribed fire because we do that for the benefits of it, but with burn piles, we're actually scarring and potentially, I hate to say causing an issue because sometimes it's necessary to do this, but more or less.
yeah, and I mean, and it's just understanding. I would say I would compare it more to having like in a grazing area, having a sacrificial zone around like a feed trough. That it's just going to get beat up, but we can plan around that, and we're going to make sure that we're locating things with a minimal impact, right? And a lot of it with in pile burning, again, it's so similar but yet so different than broadcast burning. Broadcast burn, that fire, unless you have like very little wind, that flame is not going to be in a single spot long enough to really heat the soil much, right? And that's why, it doesn't really impact the grasses, and you can see green growth coming back in a week or two. But those brush piles, and they're just putting heat down and cooking it.
Yeah,
Uh,
that makes sense.
One thing that, and this is a study we're setting up right now is, when all the ash that pile generates, though, is a huge nutrient source for plants and animals, right? So you're taking all the different, minerals and nutrients that are bound up in the plant tissues, and we're turning it into elemental ash, which, again, I don't know if you've seen this, but we've, if you have a burn scar with a bunch of ash in it, you will, and you're trying to move cattle through there, you'll see animals in it just licking ash, licking the rocks, trying to get some of the mineral up. I don't have anything quantitative on it, but that, like I said, that is an area of study that we're setting up right now to really look at, how how do wildlife and animals interact with unburned brush piles and these burned pile scars, and kind of looking at something that like a lot of good science, something I've seen in the field, and it made me think, it's like, oh, that's kind of weird. I wonder, is this just the cattle that we have here in this one spot, or is this an actual
Yeah.
pattern?
Yeah, that would be interesting. Uh, Once I'll start looking at that, if you could scale it even larger, and is it regional that some animals do it more because of what they aren't getting in their normal feed? So I'm interested in that. Keep me updated.
Yeah, yeah, and I would bet too, you would probably see that more in, and this is just my expert opinion, I guess, you'd probably see that on range fed, livestock that have limited mineral supplementation. Because that, just like if you have a salt lick or, open mineral available for livestock, they kind of, if their little animal body tells them that they need calcium, they'll go over and they'll start licking it, licking on the salt. Yeah, I think it's going to be that same deal, just instead of, at a salt lick or that loose mineral tub, they're going to that brush pile burn scar. I would also assume it's very likely to be less efficient, but
Yeah.
that would be a situation again, that something that would be interesting to test in a kind of a scientific way, and
Yeah.
would be kind of neat and relevant.
That's interesting. Um, okay, so going back a little bit, you mentioned we can't burn at night. Are there
Mhm.
any other like laws or regulations? I know like I've gotten the question before, do people need to notify somebody before they start burning? How does all that work?
Yeah, so I would say, at kind of a very high level, I always like to treat broad pile burns like any prescribed fire, right? In the sense that, to me, and I actually write burn plans for mine. And it's not, because I, legally have to, but to me, it is a good process because it makes you sit and it makes you think through what are the weather conditions I want to burn in? Where's that smoke going? What kind of preparation do I need? How many people do I need to burn this safely? Right. I would always encourage folks, write a burn plan. It is also useful, it is a helpful planning tool. It is also a helpful tool to demonstrate that you have done your due diligence in planning that burn. Um, of course, as a part of that, I would also always encourage folks, before you burn, call your county dispatch, your local VFD dispatch. And just let them know. I mean, first off, check if there's a burn ban, don't burn brush piles. Very obvious, but
That
don't
one's a
burn.
pretty
Yeah, there are very, very few exceptions to the ability to do that. But yeah, call dispatch. I mean, and for me, it's, every time I've done it, we've got land in Coryell County, but is call sheriff's dispatch and like just let them know, hey, we're at, I'm Chase, I'm at this address, we're burning brush piles today. We're gonna get started around 8 o'clock. We should be done by 2. And then once the fire's done and everything is out, calling back, thing God forbid does go wrong, they already know where you're at, how to get there. They're not having to spend a ton of time getting information from you to get people out to that property. So that would be kind of the first deal. As far as weather conditions go, like I already said, don't burn at night. Don't. All right. It is not safer. It is not. I mean, it's not legal, if nothing else.
sure.
And we have conditions where you can again burn during the day, and you can set up your brush pile burn setup in order to maximize the amount of burning you get done. We already talked about that. I don't need to delve back too deep into it. I do think from a weather perspective, we need to make sure we're following all outdoor burning weather limitations. They say out the outdoor burning code says that you need to burn in a minimum of 6 mile an hour winds, maximum of 26. I will tell you, if you are burning in 26 mile an hour winds on a brush pile burn, I don't want to be there with you. That
Yeah.
is not a wise move.
I don't want to witness that one.
You do want to stick on that low end. And again, the reason being is it makes our flames predictable, but also, again, unlike some broadcast burns, we are those pile burns, they make a lot of embers, right? We want those embers to
Yeah.
go straight up and, very minimal drift. We want them to go as high as possible where they burn out and then they just drift as ash. As soon as we start adding higher wind speeds into it, like I said, it lays those flames over, but then you're also shooting those embers out at an angle, which then, instead of going up and then moving and falling, they don't get as high before they fall. And so you don't have as much, complete combustion of those embers, right? So it increases your
Yeah.
spot fire risk. It just makes everything a lot hairier and harder than it has to be. Um, let's see. I think another fun, it is only legal, and this is coming from, there's a specific separate statute in the Texas Administrative Code for debris burning that is completely separate than
Oh,
prescribed fire. So
okay.
most people don't know this. We discovered this about 4 years ago when we were putting out an extension bulletin on this topic. And so the main things when it comes to brush pile burning, aside from the general outdoor burning prescribed fire, guidelines, you can only burn plant materials, and you can only burn plant materials from the property it came from. So it is not legal for you to take your
Interesting.
neighbor's brush piles, haul them to your side of the fence, and then burn them.
Interesting.
It is not legal to burn. Trash burning is also its own separate thing from brush pile burning, but you really, you should not be burning tires. You should not be burning, you should only be burning plant materials that were generated on site. And kind of the last little potential hiccup is, and I mean, this is I am simplifying a whole lot of like
Yeah.
administrative legalese. Like I said, if you want to read about this and you want to know it, we have a publication out. We can post a link in the chat after
Yeah.
this call's done. But you can't burn under what's called a non-attainment day, right? Which basically the short and sweet version for an Aggie like me is if you have an air quality warning, right? If you look on the National Weather Service or your phone says, hey, it's a high ozone day, or you have an air quality warning, limit your time outside, we see those, we get those. If your county has one, you are not allowed to burn. You're not allowed to burn brush piles or debris. And again, where that's coming from is that's coming from the air quality regulation, right? So when we have high pollution days, we're not sending more into the air and further degrading the air quality. That's kind of the rationale behind it. Where we tend to see those days the most is this time of year. We get these big heat domes. We, kind of like in the last couple weeks, you have these big heat domes. They settle over Texas, and it's just hot. The wind isn't really moving. The weather isn't really going anywhere. So that pollution doesn't have anywhere to go. So it accumulates, and then that's when we start getting those high ozone days and those air quality warnings. The good news is, generally speaking, those are really terrible days to be burning brush piles anyway.
The
So
laws are there for a reason.
yeah, but again, it's just something to be aware of. You know, there are some links you can go to specifically check attainment status and whether you have an air quality, day or not. But I would say again, just in general, if you have an air quality alert for your county, just don't burn brush piles that day. Easiest
Right.
way to not have to worry about that. Um, let's see. I mean, I think that's kind of the real highlights of it. I do think of, we talk about regulation and then it goes into liability. Of course, remember, you're always responsible for the fire you put down, right? So if that fire gets out and it gets on your neighbor's property, or, it gets out of control and, causes property damage and things like that, you are the one liable for that. So, and I don't say that to be scary. I don't say that to discourage people.
It's good to
Rather,
know, though.
yeah, I mean, to me, it's no different than if you have, if you've got a crummy fence and your cow gets out and someone runs into the cow and causes damages and injury there, right? We're
Right.
responsible for the management actions we put on our property. And so, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I
Yep.
know it seems like, holy smokes, Chase makes a, burn plan for every single one of his brush pile burns, but it's also a way to make sure that I'm staying within the ability for me to safely do that. I will also say I don't do one for every single individual brush pile, but
Sure.
if I'm going to be going out, like I had, you know, went out and burned 15 brush piles in May. So I had one burn plan for all those brush piles, and that included the management and the burning and the ignition process and everything for all of them, right? Just I don't need to make 15 burn plans for 15
Sure.
piles, but you should be making a burn plan, for every, if you have, for piles within a single management area, right? So if you've got one pasture and we're burning everything in pasture B today, that should be under a burn plan. If we're burning 10 today and 10 tomorrow, each of those should also be under a burn plan. Or you can copy and paste, use it twice, but you want to make sure that we're, you know, every kind of group we're doing, we want to make sure that's under a burn plan. Again, Texas Parks and Wildlife has templates. TDA, I think, has some. They're not hard to write out, and there are resources available that can help walk you through the process. It's just more of, in the same way, if you were to go put out an herbicide, just going in and kind of planning out, all right, what are the weather conditions I want to spray on? What am I trying to spray? What product am I using? It's a very similar mindset, and it doesn't have to take a ton of time. It's just a way to make sure that we are organizing our thoughts, we're doing the right prep, and then we have documentation that we were doing the right things. So those would be the highlights.
Yeah. And then we talked a lot about burn bans, and then also just kind of, some stipulations with burning burn piles. If let's say all this sounds really scary and we don't want to do that anymore, what are some alternatives to brush pile burning?
Yeah, I will also say that did remind me, everything I talked about is for outside of city limits. If you are inside
Yeah.
city limits, that is your city fire marshal has the final say on all of that. And if you are in city limits, everything I said goes out the window, because that fire marshal is the one who can actually, determine whether or not you can burn. So I thank you.
Yeah.
And I think then, yeah, what do we do if we can't burn? Right? What are we going to do with this debris? Because if we can't burn for whatever reason, whether it's weather, whether it's regulatory, whether we're within city limits, if you've got 5 acres in the middle of Frisco and you've got a bunch of brush, what do you do? And I think kind of similar to that, I forgot to mention this one earlier in the laws and regs too, but it's brush pile. Burning a brush pile is really, from a regulatory standpoint, that is our last resort option. We should be doing, we should be making reasonable attempts to find other ways to dispose of this brush. Realistically speaking, our alternatives are basically, mulching. Well, I guess mulching, you can scatter it as slash, or you can just leave a brush pile unburned. I'll kind of talk about each of those. So the mulching, straightforward, that can be done either with, the kind of the classic Central Texas, forestry mulcher on the front of a skid steer, drive it in, turn it all down into coarse mulch. If you have access to a wood chipper, kind of like you see the tree trimming crews have, that works great as well. Keep your fingers out of the spinning bits, of course, but mulching can be really good. Where mulching works really well is you're turning a large volume of debris into a much smaller, more compact volume. And that mulch, you can find uses for it. If you've got hiking trails around your property, put it down and cover some exposed soil. If you've got garden beds, you can use it in there. I think the main things from a mulch perspective, you can also spread it on exposed soil to kind of help, again, prevent erosion, surface erosion, things like that. The main limitations with mulching is one, there's a reason we put mulch in our garden beds. It's because it does suppress plant growth, right? So if we are generating a whole bunch of mulch, you either want to concentrate it all into one big pile, or you want to spread it out thinly. You can get a rake behind a tractor, something like that. You just want to rake it out. We don't want multiple inches of mulch buildup, because that's going to, especially again in those high productivity areas, that's going to really impede the growth and emergence of your good forage areas. You can, however, use it on areas like kind of rocky hillsides, things like that, where you've got exposed soil and ain't nothing growing anyway. That can be something you can put out that is not a major trip hazard like slash would be, but would still get something on that soil to help keep it in place. That mulch will also decompose a little bit faster, smaller chunks, more surface area, more soil contact. They'll decompose faster, and that can be, a source of organic matter being introduced into the soil, as a soil health amendment. Of course, the drier we are, the slower that takes. I would say one of the big risks with mulch is if you have a pile of mulch and it does catch on fire, that is, it's like catching a hay bale on fire. You are not getting it out. And so you need to be very certain of where, if you have piles of mulch or things like that, that we are not letting fire get into it, or we are putting it in the middle of a big old burn unit where it can safely smolder. I've been on prescribed fires where fire got into mulch, and you cannot put enough water on it to put it out. It is just going to smolder and creep, and it is awful. Just if any of y'all have ever been in that situation, you know what I'm talking about. But other than mulching, so just spreading slash, right? So this is, and I will say slash versus debris, right? I use woody plant debris because that is anything woody that comes off a tree. That could be an entire cedar tree you cut off with tree shears and you haul off, bulldoze, mesquite, whatever. But when we talk about slash, it's really, the different limbs. So like we take it one step, deconstruct it one step. That slash is really good at, can be effectively used to kind of manipulate that erosion and grazing management side. And what I mean by that is so we can take that slash and we can put it, again, kind of on rocky hillsides, on areas that, need some protection, and it can help intercept the raindrops and slow the wind and all that kind of stuff. Like mulch, you can pile it too deeply. I would say with slash, you should be able to see the ground through it. If you cannot, you are probably stacking it too thick and you are going to suppress the plant growth below it. Something I've also seen used is you can get that slash, particularly with mesquite slash, because as the thorns on it, you can use them for good and not evil. In that, if you've got an area of a pasture that is under continual grazing and maybe you've put out some grass seed, or you're trying to encourage an area to regrow and get some of the grazing pressure off of it, you can put some of that slash over that forage. And just, the goal is to deter an animal from wanting to graze there, right? If they have perfectly healthy grass right here, and they've got a bunch of spiky branches over the, slightly tastier but harder to access grass right there, the goal is to kind of push them into these other forages that these can recuperate. So, you can also have seen slash if you've got gullies. Slash works a lot better than washing machines and old cars and things like that seem to wind up in gullies as, I guess people having hopes and dreams and wishes of erosion control. The reason slash works better is because, it interlocks a lot more. You've got a lot more finer branches, and so it does a much better job of catching moving soil particles and kind of retaining the soil there. We can also just broadcast that slash out in the field. And then, especially if we're going to be burning that field in the future, we can, when we run a fire through it, it's going to partially burn that slash down, do that once or twice, and that slash is now ash. And then the last one is just leaving unburned brush piles. It's not always ideal, again, especially if they're not, particularly nicely placed. But, in the right scenarios, they can be useful for wildlife habitat. A lot of times, again, this is something that in that study I talked about earlier, we're kind of looking at what wildlife are actually using these piles. But, in certain tall grass prairies, they can be good escape cover for quail. A lot of times they're very good nesting habitat for mesocarnivores with, skunks and raccoons and rats and snakes. But it's, they can be good there. They can also be used to kind of, I've seen like windrows in particular, they can be used to kind of encourage animal traffic in certain directions. If you don't want animals going through a certain spot, maybe they'll go around if, we're putting a literal barrier there. But again, if we have a standing brush pile and we don't burn it, those are going to be there for years or decades. Especially in central Texas, and as we get on the western side of it, we don't have as much rain. That means everything takes longer to decompose, so you're going to be staring at that pile for a lot longer.
Yeah. Well, we are sorry to cut you off. We are almost out of time for today. But I have a lot more questions, so I may actually follow up with you. But for anybody that's watching, if you have other questions as well, we'd love to get those answered for you as well. But so Chase, would you mind if I put your contact information in the comments in here?
Yeah, yeah,
Or
you
is
can.
there like a website that might be a better
Um,
alternative?
I would say, you know, my email, Chase, Chase dot Brooke, Brooke at ag.tamu.edu. And I will put that in the chat as well. Um, and then, and I guess if people are really motivated to send me a letter, they can mail, you know, they can send it to the Stephenville Center. And, I do read the letters that come in. Um, you know, and if you have a return address, I will write you back. If that's your preferred way of communication. But that's probably going to be the most the best way to consistently get a hold of me. And yeah, and you know, if you have questions, ask them. This is something I love talking about. You know.
Perfect. Yeah. I learned a lot. Like I said, I went to another talk not too terribly long ago, and a lot of it was really over my head. So this helped me a lot, kind of understand at least the basics and then a little further past that too. So so thank you for today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Anytime, Carly. And you know, like I said, if you know, and if people are posting questions in the comments and stuff like that, loop me in. I'm happy to post and
Yeah.
respond or send you the answers, however, whatever works for you.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Hey, you too, and hope you get lots of nice soaking non-torrential downpours down there.
Yes, we haven't gotten crazy rain. It's been like just enough where it's really, really good. I know some of our neighbors are getting a little bit probably more than they wanted, if we're allowed to say that. But yeah, so far so good over here.
All right. Well, I
But y'all
appreciate you
too.
having me on. Yeah. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.